I wasn't totally sure. I went into the prompt. I said, okay, put discourse markers at the front of, I don't know, every other sentence or something like that. And then once it came in, the reaction was incredible. It was like people's minds were blown.
I should say, the large language models that are out there today are probably heavily biased towards English, given the sources that they're pointed at, Wikipedia and the like.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming that my premise is true, is there, and though it is, I mean, these LLMs are not thinking, these AIs are not thinking necessarily, but is there something about the output that is also therefore English biased and then sort of promoting some kind of an English speaking forward worldview?
I believe so. And I say this because in my current role, I have to do prompt engineering in English and sometimes in Japanese, but a lot of times the output needs to be in Japanese. The reason why sometimes I will do prompts, actually oftentimes I will do prompts in English where the output needs to be in Japanese is because if I do it in Japanese, it's not as effective. The question could be, well, maybe my Japanese isn't strong enough. But I think that, based on what we know about large language models from, very popular vendors and service providers like OpenAI and Anthropic, there tends to be this sort of bias toward training on Anglo languages, Western languages, Romance languages. And so prompting in English tends to be a little bit more effective. But I see this primarily with OpenAI, where in Japanese, and well, granted, this phenomenon also exists in English. So I don't know whether or not you could say it's necessarily a Japanese versus, or like an English versus multilingual thing. But OpenAI, their outputs tend to be a little bit more expository. So when I put a prompt into OpenAI, what I get out tends to be a little bit more like you said, a Wikipedia article rather than something conversational. Whereas Anthropic, the responses can be a little bit shorter and feature what is called a discourse marker at potentially the top or opening of the message. Discourse markers, they were discovered by a linguist named Debbie Schifrin, I want to say in the early 80s. And basically they're what people often call filler words. And these filler words get dismissed as, they don't make you sound smart. They sound like you're distracting from the conversation, when in reality, what Professor Schifrin discovered is that they actually show cohesion and order in conversation. So, for example, starting your sentence or your utterance with O is a discourse marker that indicates some sort of realization or some sort of uptake of information, as opposed to starting with the discourse marker well. Well tends to precede or be an indicator of a disagreement or shifting the direction of the conversation. The discourse marker so shows cause and effect or result of some kind. And so if you start your sentence or your utterance with so, even if nothing has come before it, it gives this impression that you've done some sort of thinking about what it is that you've said, or some sort of analysis about what you've said, and therefore this is what you're saying. Those discourse markers are, if I had a nickel for every time I did anything in conversation design or prompt engineering where people said, "Oh, this is so natural. How did you do this?" It's usually discourse markers. That if you put the discourse markers in, the flow of the conversation or the cohesion between turns of what's being said becomes a lot clearer. And so with OpenAI, I have to very specifically tell it to put in discourse markers, particularly in Japanese.
Do you literally use that term, use discourse markers?
Yes.
And it knows what that is? It understand. Really?
Yes. And I was very specific to use that term because I wanted to index that field of research. I knew that work on discourse markers was out there on the internet. So if I said discourse markers, then it would point at that body of work. Yeah.
It would add that to its What is the name for that when it's generating its response and it adds it to the pool of what it's doing? What is that called? I don't know the name for it either.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think maybe I just have always sort of considered it a
Because it's
factor in.
indexing it. But yeah,
Yes.
I wonder what the name. I don't know. I'll have to look that up
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
Anyway, I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No. I think, yeah. So with discourse markers in particular, whether that's in English or in Japanese, then all of a sudden it's like the clouds part and the sun comes out and the output sounds so much more conversational or so much more natural. And I think that part of what, puts people with a background in linguistics at an advantage is we have studied and been taught to think of language in these very specific ways, that they have these specific parts that do a function and that those parts are named and then we can talk about them in a systematic manner. Not everybody, I think, particularly whether it's in the US or in Japan, we're not taught to think reflectively about our language in that way. Like even in Japanese, there have been times where actually, yeah, in my first couple months here in Japan, people would say, "Oh, this conversation seems a little awkward." And I'd say, "Okay, what makes it awkward?" And they would say things like, "Well, it seems a little cold," or "It seems a little stiff." And I had to be the one from a linguistics perspective to say, "Okay, so what you're talking about is the fact that there's no what they call in Japanese aizuchi or discourse markers in these sentences." And so I wasn't totally sure. I went into the prompt. I said, "Okay, put discourse markers at the front of, I don't know, every other sentence or something like that." And then once it came in, the reaction was incredible. It was like people's minds were blown. And I think of it as, it goes back to what you were mentioning from Jakob Nielsen earlier, where it sounds like how to tickle the LLM in the right spot, or like the snake charmer or whatever. Like I'm suddenly this person who can control GPT in a way that others don't necessarily understand. And I don't think of it as much magic as I think of it more as sort of science from the linguistics perspective. I want you to do this particular, I think particularly within the subfield of linguistics called sociolinguistics, which is how we use language in everyday practice in social situations, or discourse analysis, which is how we use language in conversation. It's been so meticulously described, the kinds of things and phenomena that happen in conversation, the objective of what you're trying to do in conversation, and what that's called, that after spending over a decade of my life figuring out how to describe what people do and how they're doing it in conversation, now I just flip it and say, "I want you to do these things," and that becomes the prompt.
Thinking about then the difference between the output between OpenAI and Anthropic in this case, where OpenAI does not use discourse markers and Anthropic does. Do you feel that that is potentially a matter of the way that the underlying LLMs are, I don't want to use the word trained, but I'll just use that word for convenience.
Sure.
Or is it a matter of their system prompt, meaning the stuff that's tacked on the end after the prompt? Or is it the temperature setting, meaning the friendliness or all the things that come along with temperature? And I guess to briefly explain it to listeners, it's how friendly and randomized is it versus kind of predictable and cold. You can turn it up or turn it down. Or is it kind of a combination of all of the above, do you think? Because I mean, we don't get a lot of, that's all their proprietary stuff. We don't really know, right? But I mean, what's your best guess there?
I think it's a combination of the three. One thing that I did notice is that there's more discourse, no pun intended, there's more conversation discussion about discourse markers when it comes to prompt engineering. I can't remember for sure if I saw this, but if you don't, I highly recommend following Pliny the prompter on Twitter, because they are like the highest of high priestesses of prompt hacking. And so often what I see is discussions about system prompts in their threads. And I want to say I've seen something recently about discourse markers in particular. I can't say for sure if discourse markers was present in, like that phrase was present in the Anthropic system prompt or not. I'd have to double check because my memory is a bit fuzzy at the moment. But I wouldn't be surprised if I'm That's basically what I'm saying, is that if discourse markers is present in the Anthropic, Claude 3 system prompt, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised, because that's the biggest difference, is that I have to explicitly tell OpenAI, put discourse markers in your output in this way, regardless of whether it's GPT-4, GPT Turbo, GPT Omni. With Anthropic, I don't have to. It will do it. I can be actually quite simple and just say, hey, how do I get to Osaka from Tokyo? And it will say, oh, you want to go to Osaka? Do this. And
literally,
exactly. And the first time I saw that wasn't even with Claude 3. That was with Claude 2. And I remember
whereas OpenAI would say, to get from Osaka to, like, it would just say the facts. It would put in a header and say, trip to Osaka from Tokyo, and then, give it would read like an itinerary.
And maybe even like a Wikipedia article about the history of the Shinkansen. And I'm like, I don't need all that. I'm like, I just want to know, how do I buy a ticket? And that, I think, is where, maybe the objectives are slightly different between OpenAI and Anthropic, in that if OpenAI's objective is to be more expository and create more things like, more like articles, great. And I would probably have to modify my prompt or shift my prompt a little bit with Anthropic in order to make it a little less conversational if my objective was to create an article. There's this whole idea about how language and it changes depending on the discourse format. So Professor Deborah Tannen from Georgetown University, she did this really seminal work on the difference between written and spoken discourse. It's and the similarities and how they sort of influence one another. It's a book called Talking Voices. And in that, she talks about the different ways that these kinds of discourse formats can change. Discourse markers tend to be more along the conversational side of discourse. So if I was going to have Anthropic create a knowledge article, for example, then I would probably need to, I haven't tried it yet, but if I wanted to, then first, I would just ask it to create a knowledge article and see if by specifying that discourse format, that would be enough to essentially dissuade it from using discourse markers, because a knowledge article is inherently
that the medium is a knowledge, right? So therefore, its discourse would not include those kinds of markers because it's not a conversation. It's has a certain formality to it. It's written. It's
it's a different register, and I think that's really where I gets back to that whole idea of specificity. Like, if I'm saying I want this to be done for a chat message, that's very different than I want this to be done as a blog post versus I want this to be given as a speech. Because if you're giving a presentation or a speech, then maybe you will remove the discourse markers there as well. Because a speech isn't a conversation, it's a one-way sort of talking event. But if it's this sort of two-way talking event, and I'm asking you to create messages that a chatbot will send, well then, I want you to put the discourse markers in, because you are acting as this chatbot that will be talking to someone else, and you need to show cohesion with what they're saying.
So you, in mentioning these discourse markers, you had written about this actually in a Medium post about 3 years ago called "Conversation Design is the Future of UX," and in that you said in the opening, I believe conversation is the next wave of user experience, and conversation design is something that I think a lot of people were thinking really hard about in 2019, 2020, 2021, especially with things like, Siri and Echo, and at least for somebody who was not somebody like myself, who, when I heard conversation design, I was thinking pretty literally about, I'm going to have a conversation with technology. I'm going to be asking, I'm going to be doing voice searches and things like that. That's when I heard conversation design, I was thinking a lot about that, and maybe a little bit about this idea of chatbots and virtual assistants and things like that. But what was not on my mind at all was what is probably now on everybody's mind when we think about conversation design, which is like prompts and generative AI and like all, like that's what I think what most people think of. I'm curious because at the time, I believe you were at Salesforce.
Yes.
And did you, when you wrote that, were you foreseeing the kind of AI that we're thinking about now? Like, is that where your head was at, or were you thinking more along the lines of like, oh no, it's like the Siri and the virtual assistants and that kind of stuff? Like, what did you mean? And is this kind of where you thought things were headed, or did this feel like a pivot to you?
It didn't feel, how do I put this? I think maybe, I don't know if it's something that I foresaw, but maybe hoped. So where we are now is actually where I've hoped we would have been since, I don't know, 2014. When I first started working in conversational UX, I started working on Cortana at Microsoft. And even then, I was hoping for something that would give me a greater degree of control over these aspects of conversation that weren't quite so manual or so heavy. I mean, back then, even in 2014, I would have to sit down and talk with an engineer about state management and exactly how we're going to shift from one turn to another, which would make something like even discourse markers incredibly unscalable. So, you know, my background isn't in machine learning or anything like that, so I couldn't have predicted that it would turn out exactly like this. But my hope was always that, well, given what research is being done in AI, that eventually we might get to this place where it won't be quite so heavy. And I think now we're finally there. At that time of the blog post, what I was thinking was more along the lines of, given how much conversation design had been done manually up until that point, it would stand to reason that potentially it could be used as a data set to train on, and then therefore start to automate a little more. And then at that point, you have to really think about, okay, now that we don't have to worry quite so much about the state management piece of this, we can focus a little bit more on the, what some might call the UX piece of the conversation, or the quality of the conversational experience.